All right, welcome to the history portion of this recorded lecture series. So what we're going to be going over here is basically the groundwork of what Linux actually is and where it came from. And it kind of gives you an idea of why Linux is what it is at this point and why it's significantly different than what Windows is. So let's get into that. Here we go. Linux is an open source operating system. It was created by Linus or Linus Torvald, depending on who you're talking to. Linux is based on Unix, loosely based at this point. Unix was one of the first operating systems to use the C programming language, which is a procedural language. We are very much used to object-oriented at this point. So the equivalent to that for object-oriented would be C++. It was originally used C programming for Unix. C++ is a very popular language for Linux instead of Unix. This allowed Unix to run on multiple computers. Okay, so it had flexibility, and naturally this made Unix popular. Okay, so Unix was created by two students working at Bell Labs in the 70s. AT&T owned Bell Labs, so that's part of the reason why you hear Unix was owned by AT&T. Okay, GNU, G-N-U, GNU, was created by Richard Stallman, and it stands for GNU, not Unix. All right. The intent of GNU was to be open to the public and provide similar features to Unix. So hey, let's remake Unix and give it to the public, right? And it's part of the reason why Linux is what it is, open source. Here's the origins of it. Okay, the reasons for this is because you see in the future where computers would become black boxes if the company itself had control over what it was doing. And a good example of this, and it actually did come true for the most part, would be Mac, Apple in general, because they do have control over their operating system. Not a whole lot of people know what's going on with it, okay? All right, GNU license is the GPL. GPL states that if you're going to make a modification of the source code, then you must have that modification open to the public. 91, Linus Torvalds started the Linux kernel project under that GPL license. So thus, Linux is born in the version that we know it today. Okay. Difference between monolithic and microkernels. A monolithic kernel is a program that runs other programs. Okay, makes sense. Think of a monolithic kernel as the OS itself, very similar to what Windows typically is. That is changing over time. Microkernels is a small set of functions to accomplish a set of tasks. IPC kernels are dependent on IPC, inter-process communication. Okay, different than your CPU IPC. Okay, I do want to point that out. There's a difference there. Linux is a modular-based OS, so this is part of the reason why you can simply go to the repository and download and install different, let's say, front-end GUIs. So if you didn't like GNOME for some reason, you can download and install Cinnamon if you wanted to. All right. Okay, where is Linux used? Basically everywhere but desktop. And part of the reason why that is one, it is free. Two, it performs really well in those server-like environments. And as long as they don't have to necessarily account for every single edge case like Windows does, we're doing pretty good, okay? And then it's also very, very good at specialized devices like IoT, because it is so modular. And if you can get rid of big chunks of code that you're not going to use ever, it just makes it more efficient, and especially more power efficient for something like an IoT device. And that's part of the reason why Linux is so popular everywhere else but desktop. Okay? Linux on desktop, if we're talking about normal people, so if you're going to go to your parents or grandparents and you gave them Linux, it's not going to work. even just opening up terminal, they're going to give up. And I'm going to give you an example. I was talking with my grandmother the other day, and she was complaining about how it was difficult to order pizza because she had to enter a zip code on a web app that was well designed and very easy to do. Yeah, so give them a terminal on Linux and they're not going to do it, period. Right? So if we're talking about normal people, this is part of the reason why Linux is not being adopted by the general public. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you make it as seamless as possible. Okay? And so you're going to have to go down that Apple route where they try to do everything for you. Annoying for me, annoying for you, good for basically everyone else. All right? So yeah, we also have a negative feedback loop in here. So if a company only has 2 to 5% usage, or the usage for Linux is only 2 to 5%, and the software that they have generates most of their problems, they're not going to support Linux because it doesn't make any business sense to do so. And then, well, okay, well, you perpetuate that problem because then people don't want to use Linux because it has no support, and then you're not going to support Linux because no one's using it. So that is a problem. And to give you an example of that, I forgot what game company it was, but they had a Linux version of their game. I thought they said it was like 0.01% of people used Linux with it, and then it generated about 80% of their support tickets. So they spent tens of thousands of dollars on support and trying to fix this game for Linux when only 1% used it, or less than 1% used it. So yeah, it doesn't make any business sense to do that. So if we're talking about big picture things, if we're talking about HCI and why Linux in general is not being adopted, people do not want to learn something unnecessarily, particularly if they already know something else that does the same thing. And that's part of the problem that we have going on here, is that everyone already knows Windows or Mac for that matter, and switching to something else that is equally as good is not good enough because it doesn't do anything better. And hopefully that made sense. Here we go. So if we're going to talk about the family tree now, a little bit of a history, this should bring to light how fundamental Linux is in terms of distros, and that in reality, come on now, let's, here we go. Okay, it was open, just didn't go. Okay, so in reality, Linux is, for the most part, just a couple of primary distros and then their derivatives of those distros. So if we come down over here, okay, so we got Slackware, we have SUSE. SUSE is a big one. Typically OpenSUSE is the one that most people reference. Okay, so we got Slackware, SUSE. Then we're going to come down here. This really big one is naturally Debian. Okay, so Debian is your primary distro. Almost everyone uses Debian. Red Hat is the other one that a lot of people use, but almost everyone uses Debian, and that's what we're going to be focusing on this course. I'll be using Ubuntu, which is a Debian derivative. Let's go find Ubuntu. It's in here somewhere. Really do wish I had a search. There it is. There's Ubuntu. And then we have a bunch of derivatives of Ubuntu as well. Let's see if we can find another famous example, a derivative of Ubuntu. Ubuntu Studio, don't know what that one does. Ubuntu Genome, which is the version that we're going to be using for this course. Okay, I don't see any famous examples of Ubuntu derivatives, but that's okay because we're down to Red Hat now. So here's your other primary distro that a lot of things are based on. So here's Red Hat, and then your Fedora is going to be in here somewhere, which is your free version of Red Hat. Okay, Red Hat Enterprise, I'm assuming Fedora is going to be somewhere down here. Right there, Fedora Core. Right there's Fedora. Okay, so the primary reason why I'm showing you this is because, one, Linux, for the most part, is based off of a couple of primary distros. Each one of these derivatives of those primary distros, they try to focus on something in particular. So if we're going to talk about Pop, which is based off of Debian, I believe so. I believe that's right. Based off of Debian, yeah, that focuses on the graphical interface and making sure that it's as easy as possible to use for new users. Okay, so Pop is cool. Then we have Manjaro, which is based off of Arch, which again, it's a different distro, but same goal, where it's trying to get to the point of it's easy to use even if it's on Arch. Okay, so key takeaway here is there's only a couple distros that really preceded everything else. So we got Debian, come back up here. We have Red Hat. What else is down here? You have your offshoots. No. Android. That's what I was looking for. Android is a Linux derivative. It's kind of its own thing, but it's Linux based. 2007 Android. All right, so time to move on with that. Down. Okay, GUIs, and this is going to be the last slide. So GUIs is kind of like ice cream. They're all good. They're just whatever preference you have. So I've used GNOME the most, or GNOME the most, depending on who you talk to. I know a lot of people that use the KDE environment, and then a handful of people that use the Cinnamon environment. Again, it's like ice cream. It's just, you have your preference. It's not something to really fight over. So there is that. That is the brief overview of the history. Key takeaways here is going to be there are a handful of distros that things are based on, and if you are within that primary distro, most things are going to work. So ATP, in terms of your software management, is going to be probably still ATP within that Debian tree. And then if you're going to use something like Yum, which would be Red Hat, that's going to be good for the rest of the Red Hat, unless there's a reason why it's not and the developers decided not to, but for the most part, it's going to be the same. With that said, that's going to wrap it up for this one, and I will see you in the next video.